2020 Employment Outlook. Economic recovery is underway in OECD countries. GDP should increase by 5.25%. This is the fastest growth in nearly half a century, though it will only bring output back to 2019 levels.
Labour markets have also improved. It has improved considerably, largely on the back of the unprecedented measures taken by many OECD countries to support businesses and households through the crisis. The OECD-wide unemployment rate stood at 6.6% in May 2021, which was down from 8.8% in April 2020, when the first wave of the pandemic was peaking. The most striking improvement on the unemployment front has come in the United States, where the unemployment rate has fallen from a comparatively high peak of nearly 15% early in the pandemic to 5.9% in June 2021. The recovery, albeit faster than initially anticipated, remains incomplete. Across the OECD, there are still over 8 million more people unemployed today than before the crisis, and over 14 million more inactive people. The total hours worked in the first quarter of 2021 remained 7% lower than in the last quarter of 2019. And despite a strong rebound, pre-pandemic levels of employment in the OECD will not be reached before 2023, according to our projections. The essential economic policy task in the short term continues to be to bring the virus under control and to keep it under control through effective public health measures. Most importantly, by getting as many people as possible vaccinated all around the world. Economic and labour market recovery will remain precarious while vaccination rates remain uneven, not least because of new COVID-19 variants of concern. We need more jabs for more jobs. It will be very important to get policy settings right to encourage business investment and job creation, as well as to drive the necessary upskilling, reskilling, and skills matching required to ensure everyone has the best possible opportunity to participate and to benefit from the recovery. As governments roll out their recovery plans, it's essential to continue supporting families most in need, while better targeting fiscal policy measures designed to boost growth towards firms and jobs that have a viable future in the new post-COVID environment, by providing the right incentives for business investment, leading to the restoration and creation of more new jobs. Withdrawing fiscal support too soon would risk jeopardizing the recovery. But on the other hand, maintaining blanket support for too long would also risk jeopardizing the strength and the quality of the longer-term recovery by slowing down the necessary reallocation of capital and labour across the economy. Where activity has resumed, market mechanisms should start operating more fully, facilitating the movement of workers and resources from unviable to thriving activities. So the short-term costs of fiscal support measures can be reduced and their longer-term effectiveness can be improved by better targeting to the most vulnerable sectors, companies and households, while fostering startups and job creation. The 2021 OECD Employment Outlook also highlights the challenges that need to be addressed for a strong labour market recovery. It also advises on policies to sustain the creation of more productive and rewarding jobs. First, despite support efforts from countries, the crisis has clearly hit vulnerable groups such as young people, many women, the low-skilled and frontline workers harder. Without well-targeted measures, some of these short-term effects risk becoming long-term scars. Young workers, for example, saw large reductions in their hours of work, nearly twice as much as for prime-aged and older workers at the peak of the crisis back in 2020. Similarly, among those with low levels of education, half of the total hours lost at the peak of the crisis was due to increases in unemployment. In contrast, for the highly educated, almost all the decline in hours was driven by reductions in working time. Workers with non-standard labour contracts, part-time, fixed-term and independent, were frequently unable to access job retention schemes or to benefit from full unemployment insurance, reducing some of that effective support that they could receive. The second challenge lies in the acceleration of structural changes in labour markets, including the digital and green transition. The evidence in this report suggests that jobs that had the strongest decline in online job postings are also those most exposed to automation and demographic ageing. Private sector job creation by successful and growing businesses will be at the core of the job recovery. So what must be done? The recovery plans that countries are putting in place present a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to improve labour markets and address the key structural issues so as to prepare for a stronger, more resilient future of work for all. The 2021 OECD Employment Outlook identifies 3 priorities for this. First priority must be the effectiveness of connecting people to jobs. This involves supporting job creation with targeted and temporary hiring subsidies and helping startups and young firms grow and find the talents and skills they need. But it also involves expanding active labour market policies to quickly connect job seekers to available jobs. About 2/3 of OECD countries have increased their budget for public or publicly contracted employment services since the onset of the crisis. But increasing spending here may not be enough. How the money is being spent is, of course, just as important. Employment and training services need to be integrated, comprehensive, and individually tailored. They need to reach out to firms that create jobs and to people most at risk of long-term unemployment. The second priority is investing in effective skills policies to help businesses, startups, and workers transition to occupations and sectors with high growth potential moving forward. All efforts should be made to promote a culture of lifelong learning and linking training to individuals rather than jobs. Training programs should address bottlenecks to participation and seek to engage those who need training the most. Indeed, workers whose jobs are at high risk of automation are only half as likely to engage in adult learning than their peers in jobs with lower risk of automation. Finally, the third priority is to address long-standing gaps in social protection. During the crisis, many countries put in place emergency support for the self-employed. These emergency measures now have to be reassessed, and we should consider translating them into more targeted but more systemic responses capable of ensuring both fairness and the appropriate and right incentives to work. This means a more neutral treatment across forms of work, improved portability of entitlements, and eligibility that is more responsive to people's changing needs. Many countries are, for example, considering how to provide unemployment support to the self-employed. Chers collègues, chers amis, les plans de relance COVID.
Dear colleagues, the COVID-19 recovery plans include unprecedented levels of spending. We owe it to future generations to spend it wisely. The OECD Employment Outlook 2021 sets out policies to seize this opportunity and build productive, inclusive, and future-ready labor markets. Thank you for your attention.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Secrétaire-Général. What I'd like to do is
Thank you, Secretary General.
a bit more on some of the key messages that the Secretary-General presented to all of you, drawing from the 2021 edition of the Employment Outlook we are releasing today. The first point I want to mention, indeed, is the deep effects that the labor market had on the labor markets of all of the OECD countries. The Secretary-General was referring to the evolution of overall unemployment in the OECD countries. In just a matter of a month, in the month of April of 2020, the unemployment rate in the OECD rose by 3.3 percentage points, basically we're wiping out all the improvement that took 10 years to achieve after the global financial crisis. But this was driven by the significant increase in unemployment in few countries, the United States, Canada, and Mexico, while in many of the other countries, the increase in unemployment was much more gradual. But I think when we look at the evolution of unemployment, we see that there's been also a significant reduction in unemployment in other countries, in particular in the US and Canada, where much of the temporary layoffs were reabsorbed in the first recovery and then thereafter. Can you move the slide, please? So this is the evolution in the other countries. Many of the other OECD countries, unemployment increased more gradually, but I think as the Secretary-General was indeed recalling, today we are at 6.6%, which is significantly higher than the pre-crisis level of unemployment. The second point is that the impact of on the labor market went way beyond people losing the job and become unemployed. What we have done in this chart, we look at total hours work. You can see that in some countries, a significant fraction of the reduction in total hours work was due to actually people losing the job. But actually in other countries, much of the adjustment in our works were people reducing working time or actually stop working altogether during the first lockdown and to some extent also the second lockdown. The presentation is no longer on the screen. Of course, the decline in working time has been reabsorbed in part, but the important point is that even in the last part of 2020, still hours work were way below the pre-crisis level. We are talking about minus 7% compared to the pre-crisis level. So yes, there was some reabsorption of the loss in hours work, but this was partial. And indeed, still at the end of 2020, there was a significant gap in the hours work. In fact, the Secretary-General mentioned this point. Today, we are still with 8 million more unemployed people than we had before the COVID-19 crisis. And perhaps what is specific about this crisis, we had 14 million people less into the labor market. They're withdrawn from the workforce because during the first lockdown and second waves and third waves, they thought that there were no jobs available for them. So not only we have to reabsorb these 8 million more unemployed people, but we have to make sure we bring back into the labor market those who left. Now it's very difficult to project how the labor market will evolve going forward. I think, as the Secretary-General said, we have revised upward our economic projections. There are a number of headwinds, and unfortunately, the new variants of the virus gives us a source of concern. But I think also the labor market tend to recover with a lag compared to GDP. So we say that in most of the OECD countries will recover the GDP per capita level by the end of 2022. Actually, for the employee, it will take a bit longer. We are talking for the OECD already into 2023, the second quarter. And unfortunately, in some countries where the shock was much larger, it might take even longer to recover the full level of employment that they had before the crisis. So what are the risks that we have identified in this employment outlook? First, and I think the Secretary-General indeed mentioned that, the virus can affect everyone, but the impact on the labor market was very differentiated, and some of the already vulnerable groups were actually hard hit. Here you have a decomposition by gender, by age, and by occupation. Women were much more affected than men in the first wave. Many of them actually have frontline work in the health sector. They have to juggle family and work responsibilities, and they were largely in sector hard hit by the confinement measures. Since then, I think there has been some recovery, stronger for women, so the impact in the latest data we have actually similar for men and women. You see that this disproportionate effect on youth, the decline in hours work was double for youth as it was for adults. And you see also the very differential impact for the low-paying workers compared to those with middle level of pay and actually those with high level of pay. In fact, we have seen a 13.6 fall in hours work among the low-pay one and only 1.5% for those with high level of pay. So very significant difference across socioeconomic groups. I think it is very important to pay due attention to the impact on young people. On the left-hand side chart here, we show you the evolution of the employment rate for young people as well as for adults. You can see that basically after the global financial crisis, it took more than 10 years for the employment rate of young people to recover the pre-crisis level, while for adults, actually the recovery already took place in 2015. Now you see that the impact was much larger for young people, And the challenge now is actually to avoid that with the recovery, which is coming, we actually can recover the employment rate for young people, give a future to young people much more quickly than what happened after the global financial crisis. The risk is actually shown on the right side chart, where we see already some significant increase in the NEET rate. So the young people who are neither in employment, education, or training. Interesting, some of them have become unemployed, so they're still connected with the labor market, but actually in a number of cases, some young people simply withdraw from the labor market. They are no longer actually searching for work. The other important feature of this crisis has been the significant pickup in telework. I think a few of us could actually predict that we can move so fast into telework. You see here on the left-hand side chart, we moved from 16% of the workers who used to telework before the crisis to something like 37%. So a massive use. And I think it could be argued that this large use of telework allowed many jobs to be saved and many companies to continue to operate, even during sometimes strict lockdowns. Again, what the right-hand side chart shows you here is that the use of telework was very differentiated across groups. So those with low level of education had fewer chances to telework compared to those with high level of education because of the nature of their job. Some of them could not telework, or because they lack even basic infrastructure like a computer, an iPad, or a broadband. Among the high skilled, there was a much larger proportion of workers who managed to continue work effectively and productively through telework. So yes, telework has been an important feature of the way to handle this shock, but also I think going forward, we have to make sure that everybody could have access to these opportunities. Now, the other important point I want to mention is the very large use of one particular policy response, which is the job retention schemes. Job retention schemes are subsidies to companies that reduce working time but maintain the jobs. Now, the use of job retention scheme has been 10 times larger in the first wave of the COVID crisis than it was after the global financial crisis. Now, we have made some calculations to see how effective was this massive use of job retention schemes. And what you have in this chart is that we have seen a decline in employment in number of employees of 4.2% across the OECD. If a job retention scheme were not there, the estimates are that maybe the number of employees would have declined by 11%. So we are talking about 20% of the jobs that potentially were saved by job retention schemes, and we are talking about 21 million number of jobs. So these are very sizable impact. However, as we are reopening, I think it's very important to target the support to those sectors that are still affected by confinement measures, to actually ask employers to contribute also to paying for the reduction in working time. And I think to combine those reduction in working time with training for the workers who are participating in that. These are important steps that many countries are considering while they are basically adapting the job retention schemes in the recovery phase. The other important policy, especially now that we are reopening the economy, is actually to invest in active labor market policy. It was said that there has been a significant share of countries, more than 2/3, who actually increase the resources available for active labor market policy, and actually even more for labor market programs themselves. The information we have from 2021 suggests that in the budget of this year, many countries have raised again the resources. All of this is good because there are more resources available for employment policy, which are essential to basically bring back into job the unemployed and to help those who might have to basically transit into new jobs into that. We definitely have to avoid what happened after the global financial crisis, where resources did increase, but certainly not to the extent needed. And in fact, the resources per unemployed declined by 20% across the OECD countries. And the final point I want to mention has to do with the policy to support households. The good news is that in the packages of pretty impressive measures many countries put in place, there were actually those basically targeted to low-income families, those at risk of sliding into poverty. And in fact, when we look at the, this is about the training, before I get to that. One important point is actually to invest in training. What we see in this chart is actually there is a significant fraction of workers who have low level of digital skills. On average in the OECD country, we're talking about more than 40%, 4 in 10 workers who have very limited digital skills. Many of the jobs which have been lost will not be recovered, and we really have to make sure that workers do have access to training in order to be able to perform the tasks of the job that are coming in. What is the problem shown on the right-hand side chart? which shows that across the board, across all of the OECD countries, there are large gaps in access to training and retraining opportunity for workers. Those who actually need the most training, those with low level of skills, those who are in jobs at high risk of automation, those who are independent workers tend to receive less training than, I think, the high skill and those who are in more stable type of jobs. So yes, we have to invest more in training and retraining. We have to target better training opportunities, but we have to make sure we can close this gap in access to training by targeting those who are most at risk of losing their job, or those who need it the most actually to adapt their skills in order to be able to perform in their jobs or to move into the new jobs that are coming. And now I come to the point I want to mention before, which has to do to the measure to support low-income families. When we look at the household income, gross disposable income, this actually has increased at the time when GDP was declining because of all the measures, extraordinary measures that put in place in order to support low-income families. That was an immediate, very important support to avoid the risk of sliding into poverty and into very difficult conditions. The problem is that many of these measures, as the Secretary-General was saying, were temporary, were exceptional measures put in place. It is very important now to learn the lessons of this crisis, learn the lessons of these measures, and make sure we can basically adapt these measures and make them more structural to basically close the gap in access to social protection, which are shown on the right-hand side chart here, where you see that for the countries selected in this chart, the access and the generosity, if you like, of benefit tend to be very different when you look at some of those in more stable jobs compared to those in new forms of employment or less stable form of employment. So thank you very much. These are the key messages of the Employment Outlook, and now, of course, we are ready to answer all your questions.
Thank you, Stefano. I'd just like to remind journalists they can use the chat function in Zoom to ask questions. To start with, we have some questions for the Secretary-General from Libby Cherry from Bloomberg. What does the path to recovering the next half of employment look like? Will it be harder, and if so, why?
Well, look, I mean, the pathway to employment recovery is going to be businesses around the world investing in their future growth and success because they have confidence about the opportunities in front of them. And I mean, I go back to what I said in my opening remarks. I mean, right now, the most important economic policy continues to be to get the health situation and to keep the health situation under control by getting as many people around the world as possible vaccinated. The number one, number two, number three economic policy priority right now, and hence jobs creation policy priority is to get people all around the world vaccinated as soon as possible. And beyond that, of course, you know, we need to ensure that we improve the mix of fiscal support measures to be more forward-looking, to be more targeted as we move towards, I guess, the next phase of the economic recovery. Ultimately, we need to get into the situation where the economy is able to adjust, where we are able to identify those businesses with a genuinely viable and growing future, with genuinely viable and productive jobs. And that is going to be a process. You know, when the crisis first hit, it's very important that governments around the world stepped up and provided blanket crisis-level support to business, to households, to protect people's lives and to protect people's livelihoods. We are now in the initial recovery phase, and it's important to maintain elevated level of fiscal support at this point, because to withdraw that support too quickly would put the recovery at risk. But by the same token, maintaining blanket support for too long would also delay the necessary adjustment and hence weaken the strength and delay the onset of the genuine longer-term recovery moving forward. So there's some finely balanced judgments to be made, but ultimately the strength of the recovery will come from private sector businesses around the world investing in their future success, and they will have to be the businesses that have a viable future in the new post-COVID environment.
She has a follow-up question related to job retention schemes. You call for more targeted job retention schemes. Yeah. Does that also mean that such schemes should be in place for longer? Yeah. And how long would you advise such schemes to be in place?
Well, you know, in terms of job retention schemes, I mean, they were very important when the crisis first hit, and governments around the world, including the government I was a part of, you know, made very swift decisions to provide support to business, support to workers, and increase support to those who lost their job through no fault of their own as a result of the crisis hitting. Moving forward, the fiscal support has to be more targeted towards continuing to facilitate the recovery. Of course, I mean, there's got to be targeted support to those sectors that have been most severely impacted. There's got to be more targeted support to those most in need of support. But beyond that, it's got to be really about investment in future opportunities. It's about forward-looking growth opportunities. And indeed, it's also giving the space to the economy to adjust and for the reallocation of capital and labour across the economy to be able to take place in the context of identifying, the market identifying, which business have a viable, successful future in the post-COVID environment.
I have a question from Angel Calvo from FA. It's quite country-specific, I think it may be for Stefano. Pourquoi la Colombie et le Costa Rica sont les pays?
Why are Colombia and Costa Rica the countries that reduced unemployment most since 2020? Is it because of the low use of furlough? Well, maybe one of the factors that impacted the low reduction of unemployment is based on these systems. But these are also countries where there's a lot of tourism, and in many OECD countries, tourism played a key role with a significant impact, of course, and in terms of reduction of unemployment and economic recovery. Of course, there are key factors, the possibility of reopening our borders. This is essential for those who live on tourism. And so there are several factors. It's the impact on GDP, impact on sector-based jobs. Some were more hit than others in some countries, and how and whether we can and how we can reopen the economy in the hardest hit sectors and hardest hit economies.
From The Guardian, he's asking about labour shortages. Can I ask your views on labour shortages in several advanced economies, including the UK? How problematic could these shortages be for the recovery? Will it fuel wage growth and inflation, and how should governments respond?
It could be problematic, but it's not unique to this crisis. We have seen also in previous economic crises that the job loss are not the ones that are recreated in the recovery phase. So there could be a growing mismatch between the skills and competence of the workers who have lost their job and actually the skills which are in demand in the jobs which are being created. And that's why I think we have been emphasizing a lot the need to invest in training and retraining, focusing on the unemployed, but actually focusing also on those who might be in sectors or in companies who might not be viable, and actually that might be facing joblessness down the road. So training and retraining, in my view, it's essential to really reduce this mismatch, reduce these labor shortages that does exist in some sector, we have seen it already, and actually make sure that we don't have unemployment becoming entrenched. So we move from unemployment to long-term unemployment. We know all that well that when people have been out of job, unemployed for a long period of time, then it becomes much more difficult to bring them into the labor market. Now, the good news to some extent of this recovery is that most, if not all, of the OECD countries are putting a lot of resources into the recovery programs. And I think in the Employment Outlook, we also discuss some of the way in which some of these resources could be invested. In active labor market policy, a strong focus on training and retraining, in particular for those most at risk of losing their job or those who are already unemployed, actually understanding better in those sectors in which there are shortages, what are the skills that the employers are actually asking for, and try to make sure that the training offer cover these skills so that we can really close or reduce this mismatch as quickly as possible.
A couple of people asking about long-term unemployment. How can long-term unemployment be a risk when at the same time you're saying that labour markets are improving?
Well, essentially, I mean, the risk here is that people, and in particular young people, have been disconnected from the labour market and are not in training or education. And if they remain disconnected from the labour market and training and education over an extended period, then the pathway back for that cohort of unemployed or job seekers will become harder and harder. And that is what we're trying, that's what we have to work to avoid. And that's where, I guess, in our recommendations, that's where we talk about needing to take measures to avoid long-term scarring. This is a real risk that there's a large cohort of young people who were severely impacted by this crisis, that were disconnected from the labour market, that are not in training and education. And if that continues over an extended period, irrespective of what is happening in the economy overall, they will not have the appropriate opportunity to participate and to benefit from the recovery.
We have a question from a Brazilian reporter. What would be the best policies to help low-skilled workers?
Training.
I think if I can elaborate on that point, is training, training, and training. There is no question, but also guidance. What we observe in many countries, not just in Brazil, but across the board, is that some of the low-skilled workers cannot participate in training because they don't get offer of training. They might feel they don't have time because some of them work in very small companies, and it's difficult to stay away from work in these companies. But in some cases, they might not actually understand what type of learning and training they might need, what kind of skill they might have to acquire. Or for some of them, the experience in education was not a particularly good one. So the idea of bringing them back into a standard education setting might not be the right approach. I think the digital technology gives us many opportunities to actually tailor-make training programs that are needed and to some extent are tailored to the needs of individual workers, but also are delivered in a way that actually can bring more of those who do not participate oftentimes in training to do so.
She has a follow-up question about youth. This young generation is one of the best prepared generations ever, but are not being retained by the labour market. What are the policies that countries can adopt to face this problem?
Well, this is indeed the paradox, right? We have the best generation of young people entering the labour market, and yet, as we show, the youth unemployment and the number of declining hours is double that of adults. This is not the first time. Again, after the global financial crisis, we have seen the same thing. There are a number of reasons why this happened. I mean, because young people entering the labour market could not find a job, because the last months or year of education has been very problematic for them, or because those already into the labour market were in more precarious, less stable forms of employment, and they were in sectors deeply affected. I think it is very important to avoid the fact it took 10 years after the global financial crisis to recover the employment rate for young people by investing on them. I think young people have very different problems and different barriers into the labour market. So we really have to have a packages of measures which are well tailored to their need. In Europe, we are revamping the youth guarantee, which is a way really to offer to all young people who could not find a job a suitable type of support. Sometimes it's guidance, sometimes it's training, sometimes it's actually job search support. So there are different tools that can be used, but we really have to try to close this gap in unemployment for young people quicker than what happened after the global financial crisis. Otherwise, as the Secretary-General said, there is a risk of scarring effect. Closing remark on that, in previous work we have done in the Employment Outlook, we discovered that the first 10 years of work experience are essential for the career of individuals. Now, after the global financial crisis, many young people lost a good part of these 10 years, and we definitely have to avoid this happening again in the aftermath of the COVID crisis.
We have time for one last question. What else can be done to boost job creation? A couple of people have asked.
Well, I mean, in the end, and I used to say that quite regularly in my previous job, jobs don't grow on trees. I mean, jobs are created by viable, successful, growing businesses. Most jobs are created by private sector businesses. So, in order to boost job creation, we've got to boost confidence and incentives for businesses to invest in their future growth and success, because viable, growing, successful businesses will hire more people, and that ultimately, that's where the jobs come from. So collectively, policymakers will need to continue to think about how we can best restore confidence across the economy more broadly, how we can strengthen confidence for businesses to invest in their future, and I mean, that is going to be the core engine to maximize and to optimize job creation moving forward.
Thank you, Secretary-General. Thank you, Stefano. We will close this press conference. Thanks, everyone.